The VMI Leadership Book Program encourages reading within the Corps cadets and serves as a forum for discussion on current and sometimes controversial issues associated with various leadership styles. The program is managed by cadets and sponsored by the Center for Leadership and Ethics. When possible, the program brings authors to the Institute to allow the Corps cadets to learn more about specific leadership styles and to ask questions in formal and informal settings. That is the case this evening. Commander Kirk Lippold, U.S. Navy retired, was the commanding officer of the USS Cole when it came under a suicide terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda in the port of Aden, Yemen. This event is widely recognized as one of the most brazen acts of terrorism by Al-Qaeda prior to September 11, 2001. Commander Lippold has briefed over 5,000 military officers and given over 200 presentations on the seminal event and on the war on terrorism. Lippold's assignments prior to the USS Cole include Executive Officer of the USS Shiloh, an Aegis-class guided missile cruiser. His department head tour was unique in his assignment to the crew that commissioned the USS Arleigh Burke, the Navy's first Aegis-guided missile destroyer. He served as the operations officer responsible for the training and operation of a next-generation $1 billion warship with a crew of over 300 sailors. He had 2 division officer assignments, which included a tour on the USS Yorktown, an Aegis-class guided missile cruiser. There he completed a lengthy 7.5-month deployment to the Mediterranean, where he participated in the Achille Lauro aircraft seizure, Black Sea freedom and navigation operations against the Soviet Union, and attained 3 combat operations in the Gulf of Sidra off Libya that followed several Libyan-sponsored terrorist attacks in Europe. His initial division officer tour was on the USS Fairfax County, a tank landing ship where he completed a deployment to Beirut, Lebanon, in support of the U.S. Marine Corps and the multinational peacekeeping force where terrorists attacked the American embassy and severely damaged it. Commander Lippold is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, receiving his Navy commission in 1981. He received a Master's of Science in Systems Engineering from the Navy Postgraduate School and is a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College and Joint Force Staff College. His personal awards include the Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Meritorious Service Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, Navy Commendation Medal, Joint Service Achievement Medal, Navy Achievement Medal, in addition to various campaigns and service ribbons. He serves on the Board of Directors for Military Families United, one of the nation's premier family advocacy groups, and is a member of the Board of Advisors for Halo Maritime Defense Systems. Commander Lippold's book, Front Burner, Al-Qaeda's Attack on the USS Cole, recounts the story of Al-Qaeda's bombing of his ship and the continuing ramifications for the war on terror. Please join me in welcoming Commander Kirk Lippold. Thank you very much.
All right, good meeting. Nicely done. Well, good evening, everybody. Before I begin my formal remarks this evening, I'd like to take just a minute and stop and thank each and every one of you. Each and every person that sits here tonight, even though it's a state-run school, raised your right hand and chose a life of consequence to go through a curriculum here to learn what it really means about integrity, accountability, and moral courage. And for that, I commend each and every one of you. But I also want to thank you on a little bit more of a personal note, because while I may have been blessed with a great crew on the morning of October 12th, including a VMI graduate sitting over here, Greg McDearman, who was my first lieutenant at the time, I also know that the crew and I could not have done what we did that morning, surviving October 12th and the 17 days that followed, if it weren't for the thoughts, the support, and the prayers of you as Americans back here at home who sustained not only us, but also helped us get through and the families get through that tragic event, wondering if their loved ones were alive, were wounded, had been killed in that attack. So on behalf of my crew, but also those young men and women that are out there today, tip of the spear defending our freedom, thanks for what you do, and thanks for choosing that life of consequence to serve our nation. A little bit of terms of art, BMI, military school, Army-based, so I need to make sure we get terms of art down right off the bat. When I talk about the left side of the ship, just think 4 letters. Left side, port side. Right side, starboard side. Pointy end at the front, that's what we call the bow. The blunt end at the back, we call the stern. That's also the flight deck where we land and take off helicopters. When we talk about floors, we call them decks. Ceilings or overheads. Walls we call bulkheads. Hallways we call passageways. And I will make it a little easier by not using the term athwartships as I go through the whole presentation tonight. But I was fortunate enough to stand at the very back end of that flight deck on USS Cole and say the three greatest words of a naval officer's career: I relieve you. With those three simple words, I carried out a centuries-old time-honored tradition where I assumed total accountability and responsibility for a $1 billion national asset and the lives of almost 300 of our nation's finest sailors. USS Cole was part of the George Washington Aircraft Carrier Battle Group. We were in that period between when one deployment ends and the next one starts. That's called an interdeployment training cycle. We were just finishing up the first of 3 phases of training and had about 1 year left. But as I walked aboard that ship, knowing we were going to start operating with other ships, operating with the Carrier Battle Group, start working with other forces ashore as well, I knew from the moment I walked aboard and observed them, my crew, both in port and underway, that there was a depth of talent with them that had yet to really be exploited. And as I sat back, I said, okay, I know what this crew may be capable of, but I need to find a way to convey to them what my goals and expectations were, what my standards were for wanting to run that ship. What I'd like to do this evening, just to run through them real quick because you'll really understand why they truly laid the foundation for us to be able to survive that event, is share with you these key pillars of leadership. Okay? Everyone talks about that one word right there. You all have it. It's pounded into you. You love it. But a lot of times when you wonder, how do I describe that word? What is integrity? A lot of people will tell you that integrity is doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, even if no one is looking. I'll agree with that 100%. But I like to take it one step further. Those things to me mean ethics. When you do all those things regardless of the consequences, then you're talking integrity. Personal consequences, professional consequences, but when you do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, regardless of the consequences, then you're truly talking integrity, because that's when the decision gets tough. That's when you really peel away those that can withstand that moral courage pressure and do what's necessary and do what's right. So I'm teaching a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds this. You want to know something? You set that bar high, they will measure up to it. The next thing I had to look at is I knew where we were as a ship. I knew where we had come as far as training to that point, but I also knew where we needed to be 1 year hence. I needed to make sure USS Cole was ready to go out there and do what we in the Navy say is be prepared to conduct sustained combat operations on the high seas to secure national security objectives. We needed to make sure that we could go toe-to-toe with anyone in the world and come out on top and secure it for our citizens and our national security interests. That's what we really set out to do. Now I needed to convey that same vision to the crew, make sure they understood what they were going to be a part of. Because once they understood what they were going to do and how they were going to contribute, they take ownership of it. Well, you know as well as I do, once you assume ownership of something, then you're going to be able to be a part of it, understand what your role is in it, contribute to it, and make sure that you're doing something and feeling like you're doing it worthwhile for the ship. Next thing I looked at, hey, we all live in that world. Each and every one of you do. Try teaching that to an 18 or 19-year-old, where these days a lot of people say, oh, don't even talk to the young kids today about it, because they have no concept of what personal accountability and responsibility is about. I didn't believe that for 1 minute, and I don't believe it today. That is not a leadership burden for those that are going to go into positions of leadership. It's a challenge. You have to work it, and you can step up to it every day. What it really means is that, guess what? There is only one person in your life that is responsible for what you do. One person. That's you. Only you can make the decision to do what's right or what's wrong. Only you will make a decision whether or not to live up to that standard of integrity. Well, guess what? I can cut you a little bit of slack when it comes to peer pressure, spousal pressure, rules, regulations, and everything else. All those things are going to influence that decision-making process, but at the end of the day, who makes a decision? You do. Well, when you try to do that with those young sailors that are on the deck plates and you teach them to do that, guess what? Pretty soon they realize that they are responsible for their actions. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, they look to their left and to their right, and pretty soon they realize, hey, you want to know something? I can count on those shipmates right next to me. And they can count on me, and then guess what happens? You foster the teamwork that you want to have on board the ship. And that's exactly what they did. They began to become a self-reliant group that counted on each other, both in hard times and in the good times ashore as we were on the beach having some fun. Next thing I looked at, personally, I don't like the word empower. Never have. Okay? I like to trust and invest in people. When you're empowering someone, I've always looked at that and said, if you're empowering someone, what you're really telling them is you want them to do something you didn't want to do, and if they don't get it right, you're going to hold them in for that counseling session. Okay? When you trust and invest in people, what you're really trying to do is create the conditions for them not only to succeed, but unless they're betting metal, endangering lives, or losing money, and lots of it, give them an opportunity to fail. How many of you in here today learned your best lessons in life from the mistakes you were allowed to make, where you then recognize them, picked yourselves up by your bootstraps, use that as a reference point to lead your life forward, and then make a success out of yourself? Every single person in here has done that. Okay? Now take those personal lessons and fold those into your professional life as well. That's what trusting and investing is going to be when you graduate, step out, and you start being in positions of leadership out there, whether it's in the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force. All of you are going to be doing that. For those that choose the civilian world, I can tell you right now the business world is dying to have that standard. Make sure you live up to it, because I'll tell you what, you trust and invest in your people, they'll follow you anywhere. Last thing is you got to be professionally competent. You have to know your job, okay? The people that work for you really want you to give them 5 things. Tell them what their job is and be exacting in what you are telling them. Tell them the standard that you want them to live up to in doing that, and then give them the training, tools, and time to do that job right. So think about that. In order to be professionally competent, if somebody makes a mistake, before you call them in for that counseling session, take a look back and tell them, look, did I tell them the job that I wanted done? Did I tell them the standard I wanted that job done to? And did I give them the training, tools, and time to do that job right? Okay, just needed to get past that. Those are the kind of tools that I laid out in my command philosophy and goals and expectations that I tried to live by on a daily basis on that ship. And it would prove critical as we go on. 1 year later, here was what we achieved. Shooting the gun, several hundred rounds through the barrel. Anyone that's going to be a Marine Corps officer loves it, because when you finish shooting those things, they like to have that last round land on the beach and go off before the Marines storm ashore. They don't like those things whizzing over their head and going off when they don't need to be. Each and every one of you are taxpayers. Hey, guess what? When we were shooting these surface-to-air missiles to shoot inbound cruise missiles trying to get us, they ran about $800,000 a piece back then. Nowadays, they run over $2 million a pop. I'll tell you right now, you'd better be professionally competent, because if you shoot one of these off and you make a mistake, you don't just load another one up in the launcher and shoot it off and say, the taxpayers aren't going to mind. That's going to get all kinds of people excited, so you want to make sure that you know what you're doing. Landing and taking off helicopters at the very back end of the ship. Flight deck crew gets a little extra money every month, so they like that. And then we practice damage control drills. We wear the same firefighting ensembles that fire departments throughout the United States wear. But those things get awful hot during the hot summer of Norfolk, Virginia. That was our home port. So we'd let them take off those things, but we keep the equipment on and we train over and over and over again. I want to point out one thing, and that's that high pressure bottle on the back of that young sailor right there as we're going through the drills. We'd smoke out the compartments to where you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And the reason we would do that is because when you're in the middle of a crisis, you have to be able to think and react immediately. You don't have time to step back, ponder the situation, figure out a plan of action, and go forward. You're going to react the way you're trained. That's why we would do these drills over and over and over again, because they're going to react the way they're trained when we take a hit on the ship. But that bottle is full of high pressure air at about 3,000 psi, and the system is going to prove critical for us saving the ship. So what happens? 1 year later, USS Cole, we're now ready to go to the tip of the spear. USS George Washington and the rest of the battle group is left about 6 weeks before we did. We would actually sail across the Mediterranean, or sail across the Atlantic to go into the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, when we got to the Mediterranean, we had to suffer miserably for 4 long weeks. We had to suffer through Barcelona, Spain, Villefranche, France, Valletta, Malta, Koper, Slovenia. It was tough duty. I mean, hey, sailors join the Navy to see the world. This is our opportunity to do it. We had to suffer through pulling in on a Monday morning, telling the crew that unless you've got duty, go out there, have fun, don't get in trouble, let us know where you're staying if you're out overnight, be back on the ship for duty, and make sure you're back here Friday morning when we have to get underway and go to the next port and do drills the entire way. And they did that. They took trains to Madrid. They took trains to Paris. They went up and over the border to Monaco. When we were in Malta, they went to St. Paul Shipwreck Cathedral. When we were in Koper, Slovenia, it's the far most northern country in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, 2.5 hours later on a bus ride, they're walking around St. Mark's Square and taking gondola rides and having a great time sipping some good wine. So that's exactly what they did. But eventually, we knew we'd have to get ready to go from the European Theater of Operations into the Central Command or Middle East Theater of Operations, going from 6th Fleet into 5th Fleet. We would held back for a little bit, doing operations off the Republic of Yugoslavia for a little bit. There were some operational things going on with a guy named Milosevic at the time. I'm sure you remember him for some of the ethnic cleansing that was going on. Well, he had stirred things up. We operated there. Fortunately, nothing bad went on. And after that, well, we'd go alongside of an oiler. We'd be about 140 to 160 feet apart. And then in the middle of the ship, we bring over a high tension wire, and then using a trolley system, that's where we bring across everything that we had used up. Food, parts, ammunition, stores on board the ship. Because when you go from one theater of operations in the Navy to the next, you want to make sure that you're completely topped off and combat ready as you go from one to the next. So that's what we would do, bring all that stuff on board. Meanwhile, at the forward end of the ship, another high tension wire, and that's where we bring the hose over, hook it up, and top off our fuel tanks. Ship like USS Cole carries a little over 500,000 gallons of fuel. We had been held back until the last possible minute doing those operations off of Yugoslavia, so we would have to go at double the normal speed. Instead of going at about 12 knots as we transited across the eastern Mediterranean and down the Red Sea, we would actually have to go at 25 knots. So once we finished with the oiler, sure enough, 25 knots across the eastern Mediterranean, through the Red Sea on the, through the Suez Canal on the 9th of October, down the Red Sea at 25 knots, through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, rounded the corner at 2 in the morning on the 12th of October, we're off this little port called Aden, Yemen. A lot of people are wondering, why Aden, Yemen? What are you even doing there? Well, take a step back. We had gone from a Navy of over 4,000 ships following World War II to a Navy at the height of the Reagan buildup in 1986 of just shy of 600 ships in the Navy. To the morning of October 12, 2000, we were at 315 ships. There was no replenishment oiler within 1,000 miles of us. The closest oiler was actually up in the North Arabian Gulf, where we were going to be doing operations, working with the Abraham Lincoln Battle Group that had come across from the Pacific, relieved the George Washington, who had passed by us and now is the Mediterranean. So there's 2 ports for us to refuel at. Because of that race across the eastern Mediterranean and down the Red Sea, I'm below 50% fuel. Navy ships like to stay up around 70 to 80%, and the reason why is having that operational flexibility to stay on station for days and days and days at a time. Give you a recent example, off the Horn of Africa and Somalia these days, what's going on there that Navy ships might be interested in? Piracy operations, you got it. So right there, if you don't think Navy ships need to stay on station for a little while, go ask Captain Phillips on the Maersk, Alabama, how important it was to have a Navy ship that could stay there for hours, if not days at a time, until they could get a good shot. Because halfway through trying to get that boat close enough, you don't just stop and tell the pirates, okay, we're going to cast you off. We'll be gone 6 to 8 hours. You guys just hang tough. When we get back, we'll take the line up and bring you on in. They're going to do something quite different, and they're headed for shore. So that's why you want to make sure that we're top off on the fuel tanks. So early that morning, we need to get into the port. We would actually go in a channel. It's an area that's dredged deep enough for the ship to go in, make a series of right-hand turns, and we would be at a pier out in the middle of the harbor. That's where I'd make my first force protection decision, and by around 9:30 that morning, we've turned USS Cole around and we've moored at starboard side to a pier out in the middle of the harbor where we're going to be refueling the ship. I had spoken with a commanding officer who'd been in there 2 months before us. He told me that we could expect a refueling rate of around 300 to 500 gallons a minute. We'd requested to take on over 250,000 gallons. You can do the quick math. We're going to be in that port for at least 6 to 8 hours pumping fuel. But at least I came in during daylight. I'm going to get underway during daylight. We immediately started the import refueling checklist to try and get out of there as soon as possible. In the meantime, I pointed the ship bow out, because I wanted to be able, in this theater where we were under increased terrorist threat, to make sure that if I had to get underway in a hurry, I could chop lines if necessary and head straight out of the port. That I wouldn't have to waste time going into the middle of the harbor and twisting and turning the ship around 180 degrees before I could go, while I might potentially be under fire. That was my first force protection decision. So what happens? We start that import refueling checklist. I'm up in my cabin doing paperwork at 10 o'clock in the morning. I get a knock on the door. The main propulsion assistant comes up. He's the one that's in charge of the 4 main engines that power the 2 shafts. The 3 generators are on the ship, as well as all the fuel and lubricants. Says, Captain, I've got the import refueling checklist. It's complete. All the valves are properly aligned. Sir, the chief engineer, though, that's the person in charge of my entire engineering department. Sir, she's doing her checks down below. I'd like to speed things up. If you'd go to the bottom of the list right now and sign it, I can go wait for her in the central control station, the nerve center for my engineering plant, and as soon as she's done, we can start refueling that much quicker. I looked at him and smiled and said, you know it as well as I do, MPA. When we refuel the ship, we do it by the book. So take that list down and go wait for the chief engineer. It wasn't that he was taking shortcuts. He just wanted to speed up the process a little bit. But he was a young, talented officer. He had started out as a fireman recruit in the Navy, promoted up through the enlisted ranks to chief petty officer, promoted into the officer ranks, had 13 years of experience under his belt. A magnificent mentor to those young ensigns and junior officers learning about leadership and management for the first time in their careers. So when I look at him and say, take that checklist, buy the book, go wait for the chief engineer and bring it back up, he promptly gave me an aye, aye, sir, and walked out of my cabin. But of course, that wasn't just the end of it. As he's walking out being a good prior enlisted sailor, let's just say he was expressing also his complete satisfaction with my logic at that point. Unfortunately, though, that would be the last time I'd see him alive. 10:30, the chief engineer comes up. Checklist is complete, signed off on it. We started refueling the USS Cole shortly afterwards. At 10:40, supply officer comes up, another knock on the door. Captain, I've got a great deal. When we pulled in, the logistics agent for the port gave us what we asked for, 3 things: refuel the ship, pump all our sewage off, and top off our fresh water tanks. Said, sir, I've got a great deal though. That logistics agent for $150 has offered to send 3 garbage barges out to the ship. All 3 of those barges will take off all of our trash, all of our hazardous material, and all our plastics that we can't dump at sea. I'd like permission to do that. Well, I looked at her and said, wow, that is a good deal. No. She gives me this slightly exasperated look, and I look at her and say, hey, we're not overflowing on anything. In 4 days, we're going to pull into 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. We can get rid of that stuff for free. Let's just wait and see what we can do. And besides, $150 to me, when we pulled back into our home port of Norfolk, Virginia in February, meant 2 foul weather jackets for the deck crew working outside. So of course, like the MPA, as she's walking out of my cabin, she is profusely thanking me for my leadership and guidance as she executes her fiduciary responsibilities. Does she give up? Oh no. 10 minutes later, knock on the door. As you can tell, I get a lot of knocks on the door when we're sitting in port. She's got reinforcements in tow. This time the executive officer's with her. Says, Captain, sir, think about it. $1 billion ship, multi-million-dollar budget. We're at the start of the fiscal year spending money here. I'm sure over the next year we'll be able to find $150 in budget efficiencies. I'd like permission to do this. I didn't want to pitch the battle, so I said, fine, go ahead and make it happen. Of course, the supply officer grins ear to ear because she knows something I don't. All she had to do was walk outside and look down on deck. We're right in the middle of the ship, and then back on the flight deck, the crew had already brought all the trash, all the hazmat, all the plastics up, stacked it there, and we're just waiting for the high sign, which she gave them, and they immediately start dumping it into the 2 boats that have already come across the harbor and are waiting alongside to get trash off the ship. So all this is going on despite the captain not even knowing it, with the gamble that it would pay off, and it did. At that point, though, the XO informed me that on his way up to see me, he had stopped by that central control station. The refueling rate on the ship wasn't that 300 to 500 gallons per minute like we initially thought. Instead, the initial rate coming on board USS Cole was actually 2,500 gallons per minute. It was coming on so fast that we were overpressurizing the fuel tanks, had to holler down to the M&E fuel workers on the pier to tighten down the valve to bring that rate down to about 2,000 gallons per minute. At that rate, though, I could fill the big centerline tanks, I could fill the wing tanks, not spill a drop, but instead of being there 6 to 8 hours, I'm only going to be there probably 2 to 2.5. The supply officer was ready to feed the noon meal, chicken fajitas. Everybody was ready to go. The XO wanted permission to start feeding the crew early. That way we could cycle everyone through the mess line, get the entire crew fed by the time we finished refueling the ship. That way we could get underway, head back out to sea where Navy ships like to be and where they feel safe. I said, great idea, XO, go make the announcement. He went out, makes that announcement. I'm sitting at my desk doing routine paperwork that morning when at 11:18 there was a thunderous explosion. You could feel all 505 feet and 8,400 tons of guided missile destroyer suddenly and violently thrust up and to the right. The ship bowed in the middle, it bent up, and as we seemed to hang for a second up there, we gently slid back down into the water, and when we did, the ship was twisting and flexing in this odd three-dimensional motion. We were rocking from side to side, violently surging fore and aft on the mooring lines. All the lights had gone out. Emergency lights came on. Ceiling tiles popped out and landed on the deck. A table that had coffee and water on it spilled on the dark blue carpet. I reached up in the brace position, grabbing the underside of my desk as everything popped up about a foot and slammed back down. Once the ship stopped moving that I could let go without getting knocked over, I went over to the door in my cabin. As I stood there in the dark, there's one emergency light in my door and one halfway down the passageway. First person I see is the chief engineer runs out of her stateroom. She just looks me real quick in the eye and keeps right on going without a say a word, headed back toward the central control station. The next thing I see is I look down the end of the passageway and I see this gray cloud round the corner. It rolls down the passageway and it silently washes over me. I could smell the dust, I could smell the fuel, but I could also smell this acrid metallic tang that settled in the back of my mouth and I didn't know what it was. Young officer, living in the stateroom right behind mine, comes out, grabs the door jamb, looks at me wide-eyed and using good sailor-like language, asks me, what the F was that? Then he goes, fuel. Thinking like everyone else, we've had a fuel explosion. And he takes off into that gray cloud. I took one step out of my cabin to follow him and stopped. To this day, I don't know why, but I knew we'd been attacked. When I pulled USS Cole in, turned her around and moored her starboard side of the pier, if it had been a fuel explosion on the ship or the pier, I should have been pushed left. I'd been thrust up into the right. The only thing on the port side of that ship is open harbor water, so instinctively I know something's come alongside and exploded. So I went back into my darkened cabin, back into the bedroom area, and back there's a safe with one emergency light shining down on it, and that's where I kept the keys to the weapon systems, the missiles, the torpedoes, the guns, the 20-millimeter cannon for self-defense. I opened the safe up, reached inside, didn't grab keys. Instead, I reached down and pulled out my own personal weapon, SIG 229, 9mm, loaded it, chambered around, decocked it, grabbed 2 clips of ammunition, threw them in my pocket, went down outside the ship, ran to the middle of the ship, and stopped. I'm in a semi-enclosed area. I don't know if we're going to be boarded. I don't know if there's going to be a follow-on attack. All I know is I have to get to the port side and find out what's going on. As I look toward the back end of the ship, though, there's no one around. There used to be a 3-person watch team there. They're gone. Their wooden podium, about half the size of this one, has been blown into pieces and is scattered across the deck. The wires that used to form our high-frequency radio antennas are snapped off and draped down, and there's this dirty black water dripping off of everything. I know that I have to find out what has happened to my ship. So I take a deep breath, and I get ready to go. But right before I do, I'd remembered years before I'd stood in the center courtyard of the Naval Academy with a fresh haircut and a new uniform as I'd raised my right hand and sworn oath to support and defend our Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I'd be willing to give my life. I'm now facing that moment. That might be my destiny. I took a deep breath and said, well, this is what you get paid to do. And off I went. The only thing I could think of as I went out toward that port side is whatever you do, if you see someone that's not a crew member, you empty that gun. You empty that round. Don't leave one empty round in the chamber. Be prepared to drop the click, slam the next one in, and keep firing at them. And if you go down, so be it. But at least you're going to defend your ship. Fortunately, as I headed over to the port side, there wasn't anyone that didn't belong there. The first person I actually see is my chief gunner's mate. He is responding with the security teams to reestablish the defensive perimeter around the ship. He's got on a flak vest, helmet. He's got an M14. He starts to worry about me, telling me to get back and get down, that I'm a sniper target. And I keep telling him, Chief, get away from me. That's not what I'm worried about right now. Got him settled down. We walked over to the port side of the ship, leaned over, and for the first time I see the hole in the side of the ship. You could clearly tell, looking over though, all the metal was shoved inward, confirming my worst fears. It had been an explosion external to the ship. You could see the spray pattern of explosive residue all over the side. But also, as you looked up and down the left side of the ship, everything that was metal was slightly dished in from the concussion of the explosion, and everything that was fiberglass, like antennas, had been blown either clean off their mounts or were crumpled and lying on top of the equipment itself. But as I looked over the port side, I also see something else. 4 orange rafts. One sunk right in the area of the blast hole. 2 more lying deflated alongside the ship, but back by the flight deck is a fully inflated orange raft. First thing that went through my mind was, how did someone let these rafts get alongside the ship? Clearly the first one blew up. That's what put the hole in the side. And the concussion probably knocked the detonators loose on the next two rafts and peppered them with shrapnel, which is why they're deflated. But that one that's back by the flight deck, if that one goes off, I'm going to be in big trouble. Because if it explodes, it's going to take out the two screws that power the ship and the two rudders that steer it, and there will be no way I can get USS Cole out of port. So I immediately look back there, though, and on the flight deck at the same time, I'm watching all these sailors flooding out from inside of the ship. And what are they doing? They're coming out onto the flight deck, and they're walking over to the port side, and they're leaning over trying to see what's going on. They're curious. But what do I see them doing? They're exposing the upper half of their bodies to that explosives-laden raft. So I looked at the chief and said, unless they're part of the security teams, get everybody back inside the skin of the ship. In a moment of crisis, you will make the best decisions you can based on the information you have. I didn't know some conditions inside the ship, and I'll get into those in a minute. But pushing everyone back inside, that decision would have huge ramifications for us. Once they shoved everyone inside, though, one of the security team members came running up to me. Said, Captain, those rafts, sir, that's not the problem. The two garbage barges that had come out, we loaded them up with trash. Sir, they left and were about halfway across the harbor. We still had some stuff left when a third boat came out. It slowed down, 2 guys were in it. That's what came down the side of the ship. They even stood up and waved at us, sir. They came to the middle of the ship, sir. That's what blew up. Those rafts right there, sir, those are ours. Look. And sure enough, when you turn around and looked on the port side of the ship, where our life rafts used to be in big gray fiberglass containers, the concussion from the explosion had activated the release valves and had literally blown them out of those fiberglass containers, and that's what had landed in the water. So right then and there, I know that what used to be a threat to USS Cole, along with the 2 bombers, are now in little pieces all over the top side of the ship, and those rafts are actually ours. They're not the danger. So I said, get a grappling hook, grab them, pull them out of the way. So they grabbed that grappling hook, pulled them up on deck and got them out of there. At that point, I told the chief, you're in charge, don't let any more boats alongside, I need to get to the bridge. At that point, my timeline, which had been operating in terms of seconds, if not minutes, jumped out 1 hour. Why? I know we're going to have wounded beyond ship's force capability to treat, and I'm inside that golden hour. I have got to get them off and into the local hospitals. So I left the chief in charge, went inside the ship, in the dark, up 4 decks, walked out onto the bridge. First people I see up there are my operations officer, my navigator, and 2 senior chief petty officers. What do we have? Sir, no power, no ability to communicate, nothing. I said, wait a minute, over by my chair is a handheld bridge-to-bridge walkie-talkie, go grab it. Navigator walked over there, grabbed it, brought it back to me. I dialed it into Channel 16, contacted the Yemeni port authorities, and asked them for 3 things. First, freeze all harbor movements. We didn't know where the attack had originated from. I didn't want any ships entering or leaving until we knew. They agreed to that. 2, notify your local hospitals. They said they had 2 and they would get ambulances down to the pier. Third thing I had to ask them for was to send boats out to us. They agreed to do that, but I told them when those boats come out to us, I want them to make a huge arc around the stern of the ship. But what I really want to do when they came out to the ship, I want them to make a huge arc around the stern and come to the back of the refueling pier. Because that way I can get the wounded down to them and get them off the ship. What am I really doing in that hour? It's what I just showed that slide. You have to have that ability when you're in the middle of that crisis to not just act in the now for things that are happening up close, but for me, push out to that golden hour. And when you push out to that golden hour, you need to push out for what's going on in the next 2 to 3 hours. You have to always be asking yourself that question, what next and what next after that? Crisis management, when you really think about it, is nothing more than that ability to act in the now while still thinking ahead. But when the reality comes down to it, I'm sitting up on the bridge telling those boats how to come out to us, and when they come out, make that huge arc and come around to us, but I put a condition on them. I said, when you come out, you must not come any closer than 100 meters to my port side. If you come inside that 100-meter arc, I will shoot you. Do you understand? Now, I don't care where you are in the world. I don't care what your training manuals say. It's amazing. When you tell someone something like this, a unique thing happens. There is no problem with the English language. The boat stayed probably 400 meters away from us, made a huge arc around the ship, and very slowly approached the pier. We had to get used to boats coming out to us that no longer represented a threat. By the same token, the Yemenis now had to get used to a very angry, very agitated, and very well-armed crew pointing every crew-served weapon they had at them. 50 caliber machine guns, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, M14s, 12 gauges, 9 millimeters, and I'm sure if they'd gotten close enough, wrenches, hammers, and screwdrivers. We were going to do whatever it took to defend the ship, but we also didn't want them to get close. Fortunately, no one did that. There were no errant shots. We would eventually start getting the wounded off. In the meantime, how's USS Cole doing? We're in trouble. Every one of you have worked with a level in your house, putting a picture up or something like that. Well, there's a level on the ship called an inclinometer. At this point, USS Cole is listing over 5.5 degrees to port and down 1 degree by the bow. We could literally feel the ship sinking beneath our feet. I know that I have to get to the central control station. So I leave the operations officer in charge on the bridge. Rules of engagement became very simple at that point, a 3-step process. If a boat comes inside the 100-meter arc, warn it once with a bullhorn, fire 1 warning shot, then open up with every weapon you have. As I said, none came in. I knew I needed to get down to the central control station. I went down 2 decks, grabbed a flashlight from my darkened cabin, down 2 more decks, and started walking toward the back end of the ship. As I'm walking, though, in the dark, I look toward the back end of USS Cole, and that's where I get my first piece of good news. At the back end, I see lights on. In the back 1/3 of the ship, there's lighting. Right then and there, I know if I have lights on, I have a generator running. If I have a generator running, I can get power to pumps, which means I can save the ship. But as I walk toward the middle of the ship, there's 3 repair lockers where we kept all that firefighting equipment, all the damage control equipment in order to keep the ship afloat. There's one right in the middle of the ship, and then one at the forward end of the ship and one at the back end. As I get near the one in the middle of the ship, it's jammed shut by the force of the explosion. So right there I'm thinking to myself, okay, first real bad news, I'm down 1/3 on my damage control capability. In the middle of the ship though, that's the mess line. It runs all the way across the middle of the ship. As I round the corner, that's what my mess line looks like today. That's what it looked like back then. You can see where they line up, get their food, slide it on the trays just like you do, make a left-hand turn, they walk in, go by the drink line, and sit at the tables in the mess decks. But as I round the corner and start to walk down that passageway, that's what I see instead. A wall of metal. I don't even think I can walk down the passageway itself. So instead I back out, I walk through a door, I'm now standing outside of my main medical treatment area. And as I open the door, it's in the dark. My chief hospital corpsman, my 3rd-class petty officer corpsman, and a young striker from deck who was learning to be a hospital corpsman, they're not around. I don't know if they're dead, I don't know if they're alive, wounded, or what their status is. But as I look in medical, no one's around. So now I'm probably down 50% on my medical capability, and I only have 2 small battle dressing stations near those repair lockers at the forward and back end of the ship. So what do? You take a deep breath, you take that in, and then I realize there's a great design on these ships. The back doors of medical open out onto the mess decks. Each of those tables out there, 24 inches wide, 48 to 60 inches long, perfect width and length, take a wounded sailor, set them on the table, and do triage to save their lives. So as I go to walk out into what should be my triage area, the doors don't open out. The force of the explosion has actually blown them into medical and almost ripped them off the hinges. As I walk out onto the mess decks, all I see in the dark with a couple of emergency lights showing are shattered glass, shattered plates, knives, forks, spoons, trays, food scattered everywhere. No one's around. So you take a deep breath, I don't have medical, down 1/3 damage control, I still need to get to the port side and find out what's going on. So I crunch, slip, slide, walk across the mess decks, walk over to the left side of the ship, and when I get there, this is looking up the port side toward the bow. That's what the passageway is supposed to look like. This is what I see instead. A little bit hard to see, but just beyond that door, the deck is actually folded up at a 60-degree angle. What I didn't know is when the blast hit, it projected directly into main engine room number 1, and it took the overhead of main engine room number 1, which was the deck area in my galley, and ripped it into 4 main pieces. One peeled up into the port side passageway, cutting off the left side that you see here. One piece slammed forward into my chief petty officer's mess, that mid-level layer of leadership and management for the ship. One peeled back into the mess line, crushing and trapping sailors in the wreckage. And then one acted like a giant scoop, grabbing all the galley equipment and the sailors working in the galley, and crushed and shoved them toward the starboard side of the ship, smashing my command master chief's office, senior most enlisted on board, as well as that repair locker, and jammed them shut. Okay, left side's cut off, can't do damage control, down 1/3, no medical, right side's only available. Just putting all the pieces together. I back out, I go into the mess decks itself. When I stand in the mess decks though, I look up forward and I see that I actually see light coming from where the mess line used to be. So I walked through a small passageway. I walked up to where my galley used to be. I stood where the door used to be. That's what the galley is supposed to look like. That's what I see instead. Completely rearranged, unrecognizable. I can take 2 steps next, and I'm standing next to that piece of metal that's curled up, and I can look down into the side of the ship. There is nothing for over 20 feet. Literally everything has been blown away. Peeled up into the overhead, blown into the starboard side of the ship, or blown down into main engine room number 1. I can see out the hole in the side of the ship. I can see the sunlight coming in through the side. I can hear the water of Aden Harbor lapping in what's left of the engine room. But I can also smell fuel, and lots of it. We estimated that the Yemenis kept pumping on the ship at that 2,000 gallon per minute rate for 5 to 7 minutes after the blast. That coupled with the cracked fuel tanks, we estimated that we'd put between 60 and 100,000 gallons of fuel into Aden Harbor over the next few days. Now, my apologies to everyone. I know we've gone green as a nation, but in that particular moment, I did not pause to fill out the EPA spill report. Just some things you got to go at a time like this. So what do? Take a deep breath, but it's not what I smell that worries me. It's what I hear. Because down in all that fuel, down in what is left of that engine room, I can hear the it's the popping and crackling of live electrical wires from what's left of the engine room dipping in and out of that fuel water. And I'm thinking to myself, not only have we had a devastating explosion, now I'm going to have a major fire on my hands. I've got to get to the central control station. I back out of the mess line area, walk back through the darkened mess decks, walked out, and for the first time I'm in the lighted portion of the ship when I came face to face with the reality that a commanding officer hopes they never have to see. Lying on the deck was one of my sailors. It was very clear from the extent of his injuries that he was dead, and there were 2 sailors standing in the starboard side passageway looking down at him with their mouths slightly open in disbelief that this is actually happening. I looked down, made that assessment, walked up to those 2 sailors and said, "Hey, focus right here." All I needed was that little mental bump. They locked eyes with mine and they were back in it. I looked at the first one and said, "Where's your general quarter station?" It says, "Repair 2, sir," and immediately heads toward the forward end of the ship where that repair locker is. The other one, without my even asking, says, "Repair 3, sir," and immediately starts heading toward the back end of the ship. And that's when I had to go, whoa, wait, come back here. I need you to do something first. Before you go to your repair locker, I want you to stop by one of the aft berthing compartments, grab a couple blankets, let's bring them up here, get our shipmate covered and moved out of the way. We need to keep this passageway clear for the damage control effort. Can you do that? Said, "Yes, sir, I can." To this day, I still don't know who those 2 sailors were, but I know they did the right thing because I'd come back by that way a little while later. That sailor had been moved out of the way. Later that day, we would take them off, get them identified, tagged into a body bag, and they would begin that long journey home to their families later that night. But in the meantime, I now came face to face with that earlier decision. What I didn't know when I made my decision to shove the crew inside the ship is that when the explosion occurred, it had knocked the announcing system for the ship offline. The battery backup system for it failed. The alarm system for the ship failed. So there was complete silence. There was no way to tell the crew what had happened, where to go, or what to do. When the explosion hit, they fell back on their training all on their own. Those involved with damage control went to the 2 remaining repair lockers. Everyone else became part of the triage effort. They had grabbed up all the wounded in the area of the mess decks, the mess line, and the galley, and where had they gone? Out onto the flight deck to try and get to some fresh air. What had the captain done? I didn't know the security situation. I didn't know we didn't have a triage area, so they shoved everyone back inside. That remaining passageway down the starboard side and across the back end of the ship now became my triage area. And here were the sailors stacked up down and around the corner. 2 to 3 sailors working on every one of the wounded to save their lives. As commanding officer, I would have given an eye tooth to be able to bend down and talk to every one of my wounded sailors. But I can't. They are not my number 1 priority. My number 1 priority has to be the ship. So I step amongst the wounded, rounded the corner, and walked up into the central control station. When I walked in, it is a hurricane of activity. To my left, the chief engineer is working with her engineers, determining the status of the generator and how many pumps we have operating. To my right is the executive officer working with the damage control assistant, plotting the damage on the ship. This is why it pays to pay attention in school. You know how many weeks my young damage control officer, a nice ensign, had been on board that ship? 2 weeks. And how was he doing? Flawless, exactly like he'd been trained. But as I watched these two groups working, determining where's the damage, where's the secondary damage, what are we doing to contain it, what pumps do we have operating, and how's the generator doing, I made the smartest decision of my command tour. I kept my mouth shut. The last thing I needed to do would be to walk into a situation where I had no idea what was going on and take charge as the captain. So instead, I had the confidence in my crew to stand back, keep my mouth shut, and let them do their job. And after about a minute, I said, Chief Engineer, XO, when you two are ready, tell me what you got. They wrapped up what they were doing, came to me, and briefed me on the status of the ship. On board USS Cole, there are 4 main engineering spaces on the ship. Up forward is auxiliary machinery room number 1. That's where we have our number 1 gas turbine generator. It was running till the time of the explosion. It was now offline and we couldn't figure out how to restart it. Right behind that is main engine room number 1. That has 1 Alpha and 1 Bravo gas turbine engines that through a reduction gear power the starboard shaft that runs through the remaining engineering spaces and comes out the back end of the ship. Just behind that, auxiliary machinery room number 2. That shaft goes through it, and it has a series of pumps and air conditioning unit. And then behind that is my largest engineering space, main engine room number 2, that has 2 Alpha, 2 Bravo gas turbine engines that through the reduction gear power the port shaft, as well as number 2 gas turbine generator that wasn't running. The only operating generator that I had on the ship was actually number 3 that was backed by the flight deck and number 3 torpedo magazine. That was the only thing I had going for me, was that generator back aft. She briefed me that the brunt of the explosion had gone into main engine room number 1, that had flooded almost immediately. Behind that we had progressive flooding, going from auxiliary machinery room number 2 up into the supply office where I kept all the spare parts for the ship. I had leaking forward through cracks in the bulkhead and back aft, up forward into aux 1, back aft into main 2. Also coming into main 2 where the shaft came into the space, surrounding it, that shaft had shattered and was now water spraying in at a 20-gallon per minute leak rate. Even though she knew the answer, the chief engineer looked at me point blank after briefing me on the status of the ship and said, Captain, are we going to lose the ship? You could have heard a pin drop in the center of CCS. I looked at her and said, no. If all we've lost are 2 of the 4 main engineering spaces, we could lose a lot more and we're still going to stay afloat. We're not at what we call our floodable length. Knowing that key piece of information from having built one of these ships from the keel up proved critical not from a technical standpoint, but now saying that, the crew suddenly realized it wasn't a matter of if we could save USS Cole, it was how and when we were going to be able to do it. So everyone immediately calmed down and refocused their efforts to keep the ship afloat. At that point, knowing we weren't going to sink, I stayed there for a few more minutes until we got the electrical isolation complete. I turned the damage control effort over to the executive officer and damage control assistant. I left there and went back up to the middle of the ship. When I got there, that was the area where that podium had been. It had now been swept aside, and as I arrive up there, the good news starts coming in. There's my chief hospital corpsman and the other 2 helpers. They're already triaging and taking care of the wounded. I go up and I get briefed by the chief hospital corpsman on the status of the wounded. Already I have 1, 2, 3 sailors strapped into metal litters ready to be evacuated off the ship. He briefs me on all of them, but I looked over at that 3rd litter. It is my senior chief gas turbine technician, the senior most enlisted in my engineering department and the most experienced with damage control. He is now not available because of his injuries. But as I look over at him, he lifts his head up, looks at me and motions me over. I walked over to his litter, knelt down, and he reached up and grabbed my hand. Said, Captain, I don't think I'm going to make it. And I remember looking down at him and I said, Senior Chief, I don't want to hear that. I want you to think of your wife, Lisa, and those 2 blonde-haired kids of yours and want to see their daddy again. He said, but sir, you don't know how badly I'm hurt. Well, in fact, I did. He had just finished eating lunch and had sat down in the lounge area to watch Mission Impossible 2 when the explosion hit. The force blew him 25 feet across the space to the very back end. He was pinned under a bunch of debris. When the rescue teams finally got and worked their way back to get to him, when they got to him, he's lying on the deck, perfectly calm. He tells them, hey, don't worry about me, I'm fine. But be careful, there's body parts around here. The rescue teams don't say a word. Instead, they bend down and start pulling all the debris up and off of him.